Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. Before we get started with today's event, I just wanted to let everyone know that we have closed captioning available. To enable it, just go to the closed caption or CC icon in the Zoom menu at the bottom of your window, and then click the small arrow and select Show Subtitle, and that should turn on the closed captions in the screen for you. Also, as you can see, we are recording today's event, and that way we can make it available to you and anyone else who is not able to join us today. Thank you so much again. My name is Emma Boast, and I am the Arts and Culture Fellow at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, or MAPC. We are the regional planning agency for the 101 cities and towns of Greater Boston, and we infuse creativity into planning and provide technical assistance and capacity building services, develop cross-sector partnerships, and also run initiatives like our Artist in Residence program. Today's discussion is just a small example of the kind of work we do, and as part of an ongoing partnership with the New England Foundation for the Arts. That partnership was actually launched in 2017 under the direction of our first artist in residence, Carolyn Lewinberg. So we're grateful to have the opportunity to continue working with NEFA and specifically NEFA's public art team, Kim Zito and Kamaria Carrington, to create these virtual spaces where we can imagine the future of commemoration in our region's public spaces. This series is also co-sponsored by our friends and collaborators at the Design Studio for Social Intervention, DS4SI, which is a Boston-based nonprofit dedicated to changing how social justice is imagined, developed, and deployed here in the United States. This also builds on a recent collaboration we did with DS4SI that explored the role that planners, artists, and organizers can play in promoting spatial justice in Greater Boston and beyond. So on behalf of MAPC, NEFA, and DS4SI, thank you so much for joining us today. This is the second event in our fall series, Public Art, Public Memory. This series of webinars and workshops explores how to use public art and collective memory to achieve more just and inclusive public spaces. We actually began planning this series in early 2020, and then put our plans on hold due to COVID-19. And so we're especially grateful that you all were able to join us here today. And we also hope to see you at the next two events in the series, which will be a workshop with Monument Lab on October 6th and October 13th at the same time, 4 to 5:30 p.m. All right, housekeeping notes before we get started with our we're using Zoom's webinar format today. And so if you have any questions for panelists, just navigate to the menu bar at the bottom of your Zoom window, click Q&A, and you should be able to type a question for them. You can also leave any technical questions that come up there for us as well, or comments if you have any. So. I also wanted to just note that at MAPC, NEFA, and DS4SI, even though we are meeting virtually, we wanted to acknowledge that the Greater Boston region, where we live and work, encompasses the traditional and unceded lands of the Massachusetts, Nipmuc, and Wampanoag people. We honor their ancestors, past, present, and future, and recognize their continued survival and contributions to our society, as well as the sacrifices they continue to make. We also recognize there's a long history of colonization, displacement, and forced removal from this land, and so we wish to honor those whose hard work and lives were lost in struggles for liberation and decolonization. We recognize as institutions that work on this land and with public art that we have a responsibility to understand the past and to ensure that this understanding undergirds our work. We also, of course, acknowledge that this knowledge alone is insufficient and does not undo the harm that has been done, but we hope it is a step forward towards reorienting our collective future. So thank you so much again. I'm going to briefly just hand over the virtual mic to Kim Zito, who's our partner and collaborator and program director of public art at New England Foundation for the Arts.
Awesome, thanks Emma. As Emma mentioned, I'm Kim Zito, program director for public art here at the New England Foundation for the Arts. And we're so thankful for this ongoing partnership with MAPC as we continue to explore the role of public art and our monuments and memorials in shaping our public spaces and public narrative. At NEFA, our public art department has been committed to exploring the intersections of spatial justice and racial justice as critical context for cultivating a more vibrant public art ecosystem, as well as more just public spaces and public culture. And in recognizing the role that our permanent public art collections, including our monuments and memorials, play in shaping our collective understanding of place, we're really glad to be lifting up this conversation at this time in partnership with MAPC. Today, I have the honor of introducing our moderator this afternoon, Dr. Renee Eder. Dr. Eder is currently Provost Visiting Associate Professor in Africana Studies at Brown University and Associate Professor Emerita at the University of Maryland. Dr. Eder is a public scholar who works at the intersection of art and history, and her research focuses on monuments, race, national identity, and public space. She's the author of 2 books, Keith Morrison, Volume 5, the David C. Driscoll series of African American art, and Remaking Race and History, the sculpture of Meta Warwick Fuller. She's also written on a wide range of public monuments, including the Unsung Founders Memorial at the University of North Carolina, to the Crispus Attucks Memorial here in Boston. Currently, Dr. Eder is engaged in an open source digital project entitled Contemporary Monuments to the Slave Past, Race, Memorialization, Public Space, and Civic Engagement, which has been funded through the National Endowment for the Humanities, Mellon Foundation, the Getty Research Institute, and the Smithsonian Office of Fellowships. Dr. Eder, it's a pleasure to have you with us this afternoon and to lead us in this conversation about creative commemoration. Without further ado, I'll hand the virtual mic over to you to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Kim. It's a real pleasure to be here today to moderate this conversation on future histories, the case for creative commemoration. We will have 2 artist designers here today, Becky Davis, who's a visual artist and educator, adjunct lecturer in visual art at Brown University, as well as Mel Isidore, who's the principal designer at Isidore Studio and an MIT Master of City Planning candidate. I am to frame the conversation a little bit and point to some of my own work and as it ties to the bigger issues that we are going to talk about today. And it seems that we're at an incredible moment of deep reckoning about monuments and memorials and public space, but also around whose history and how we are going to convey history in public space. Do we reclaim monuments? Do we recontextualize? Do we relocate? Do we remove them? These are all really big questions that we are concerned with today. And they're the bigger questions that were kind of outlined in the introduction to this session. And it's really about how can we create and talk about monuments, and particularly outdated monuments in the present. What should we be doing? What are the lessons we can learn from artists who are already engaged in questioning the monument and memorial? How do we get our communities involved in very difficult conversations in public space? These are all questions that I hope that we'll be able to explore today. What I'd like to do just for a very few minutes and not take up too much time because you really want to hear from Becca and Mel, but I do want to point to my own project and research around these issues. So I'm going to show you one of the main project that I work on is called Contemporary Monuments to the Slave Past. I started this project nearly a decade ago and have created this open source Omeka site within the last 2.5 years with funding from the organizations that Kim outlined. And this project, what I'm really was fascinated with was the gap in our understanding about slavery and its memorialization. And what I quickly realized is that communities are talking about slavery and they are trying to memorialize it. At the moment, this is a very large, there's a database, an archive of monuments, including a documentation of inscriptions and so forth. So if one were to just select one of these, you can see that I include numerous photographs, but also that you can have the opportunity to actually read in detail about the object itself. We will also in the future incorporate narratives as well, exhibits that go along with this. I saw a huge gap in the scholarship, that we were doing a lot of conversation even a decade ago about Confederate monuments, but there was this gap in talking about slavery and how slavery was to be represented in public space. And I realized that there's a whole group of artists, there's about 40 artists who have created monuments within the last 25 years on this topic. So you can go to this site and explore it more fully. We're about to open it, crowdsource it in mid-October so that people can add monuments and I can continue to build this database. I also increasingly am really interested in the conversation around the removal of monuments, but I run a blog called On Monuments Here. And I do everything from talking about the removal of monuments, but also just talking about monuments in situ and what does it mean that we have a real emphasis on figuration right now in some public monuments and what does that look like? And lastly, out of my work in relationship to the Slavery Memorial Project, I was, like I think many Americans, really impacted by the death of George Floyd on May 25th of this year. And I initially actually began by writing a blog post as a way of wrestling with and thinking that memorialization can happen within the context of the internet, and how would that look like? So I began this in memoriam, I Can't Breathe, as a way of processing my own grief at watching the death on television of this man, of George Floyd. And I compiled a very long list. So you can scroll through the list and it gives you the sense of just the numbers of men, women, and children who have been shot by the police, unarmed people who have been shot by the police. And they are mostly African-American, but also have included brown people as well. So we have a wide range of lists here and you can scroll through it. So from this, I moved to creating this, which is I Can't Breathe, a digital memorial. And for the last 120 days, I have posted a memorial marker each day as a way to in some ways sort through my own grief over this process. So you can see, again, I've translated that list from my blog directly onto this. So the thing that I have been most concerned about in general with my own work are these broad issues around commemoration, around memory, and dealing with very difficult stories and very difficult histories, and how do we represent these difficult histories in public space. This is at the core of my work. It's certainly at the core of that digital memorial that I created on Instagram. And it's something that I will continue to do, looking at how we need to have conversation, but how do we also address this issue of monument, and what is a monument, and how do monuments occupy space? What are the critical issues? Who has access to those space? Who gets to be part of those conversations? So these are issues I hope that we'll get at today in our conversation. And so what I want to do actually now, and I really want Becca and Mel to have the opportunity to present their own work, is to now turn this over to Becky so that she can present to you about a 10-minute presentation of her work as well. So I'm going to unshare, and Becky, I'm going to let you go ahead and start the screen and I'll pop off.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rader. My name is Becky Davis. I am an artist, interdisciplinary artist, and a educator. I am also an uninvited guest on Narragansett Land in Wakefield, Rhode Island. I do have a slide presentation so I can share my work with you. I would like to start by saying good afternoon. Thank you to Emma and Sasha and the Metropolitan Area Planning Council for creating and facilitating this space. Thanks also to Mel and Dr. Atter, and to everyone who is watching. Thank you for your time and attention today. So my personal story starts in South Georgia in the early 80s as an uninvited guest on Muskogee Creek land. My earliest memories are characterized or founded in patriotism, in the Confederacy, and in Christianity, as demonstrated by this photograph I took as a child. So one of my earliest memories was from the second grade. My school, the school that I was going to at the time, chartered buses and drove us an hour and a half to Atlanta, Georgia, to visit the Atlanta cyclorama. The cyclorama is a 360-degree painting depicting the Battle of Atlanta. At the time, it was characterized as the sunset or the ending of an era. And although I didn't understand at the time why, this experience made me deeply uncomfortable. I was one of two Black students in my grade level. And although I didn't have the language at the time to articulate it, I realized that the history and the way it was being characterized by this experience did not include me. So over 30 years later, the events of August 11th, 2017, the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, occurred, sparking a tragedy and a national conversation about monuments and what it means to have Confederate monuments in public space, how they function, and what it really means that they're there, what that communicates. Immediately, I started thinking about this and how the presence of these objects had affected my life, or the relationship that I had to them. And growing up in 8 different cities across Georgia, I realized that there was a Confederate monument in a highly conspicuous public space in every single place that I lived. So exactly 1 year from the Unite the Right rally's anniversary, or on the first anniversary of the Unite the Right rally, I embarked on a road trip to visit all 8 cities and hold space on all 8 Confederate monuments. This project was called In the Shadow of Dixie. So one of those stops was the Old Market House in Louisville, Georgia. I learned how to drive in Louisville. I graduated from high school there. So Louisville is a very small town in eastern Georgia. And this is a postcard from around the 1940s that depicts the old slave market that is central to the town. So this project overall considers the nostalgia, the public commemoration that's inherent by these structures, and how we relate to them today. So this is a photograph that I took during that project. Each project involved me sitting in the shadow of the monument and holding space to write a series of postcards. This was a postcard that I designed for Louisville specifically. It features a quote from James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. These were designed by me and offset printed with the guidance and mentorship of Jacques Bidon, a printer here in Rhode Island. And in Georgia, Confederate monuments are protected by state law. Local governments are not even allowed to decide what to do with them. There's a law protecting them. They can't be removed or obscured. I held space in the shadow of each monument during this project and wrote to every politician with jurisdiction over each space, asking them, well, explaining my connection to the space and asking them to make a public statement about the monument. These were all of the postcards that were written in the shadow of Louisville's Market House. That intervention now exists in the world as a multimedia installation that not only documents the intervention series, but also informs the audience of the origins of these structures, how they came to be, and their connection to white supremacist delusion. It's a detail. This was the most recent iteration of this installation. This is a detail of the interpretive text that I wrote for this installation. It includes facts about that I uncovered in the research about this structure. It also includes a quote from a newspaper article written about the structure in 1897. So during the road trip of this In the Shadow of Dixie, I realized, as Dr. Ader said, that there's this disconnect. There's a large conversation about Confederate monuments, but a lack of visibility for me in Georgia for monuments honoring Black Americans and their contributions. So when I came back from Georgia, I was at the time engaged as a artist fellow at the RISD Museum here in Providence, Rhode Island. So I staged a series of performances to honor those histories that I found to be missing. Each performance, there were a series of 5 different performances. Each performance started in the museum's Grand Gallery amid these historical paintings documenting European histories and mythologies. During this first stage, I struggled to unknot a tangle of Black thread. I then went to a series of other locations in the museum, all very precisely chosen, and stitched these tablecloths or table linens, documenting the origin story of the Confederate monuments that I had just encountered. The reason why I chose table linens is because in the course of researching In the Shadow of Dixie, I found that largely all of the monuments that I encountered were organized by women's groups, and they raised money to establish the monuments by throwing entertainment parties in their homes. So this is the very first equestrian monument in the United States. It was in Bowling Green, New York. So the funny story about this monument is that it sort of documents our relationship to monuments, and it creates a precedent for Americans sort of realizing that, okay, this structure that exists in public space doesn't, it doesn't represent me or my values anymore. And so we're going to work through collective action to remove it. On the eve of the Revolutionary War, a group of colonists gathered around the monument, and as documented here in this historical painting, pulled it down. The monument, which depicted King George III, was then melted down and used to make munitions for the impending Revolutionary War. This is another equestrian monument that exists today in Providence, Rhode Island. It depicts General Ambrose Burnside, who was a general in the Civil War. So this project, My Living Monument, had a few different, there were a few different things that I was trying to address in this, this project. One was revision and repair, to take the space that was designated to honor General Burnside and use it to honor women contemporaries of his that were doing great things in Rhode Island that don't have their own monuments by and large. It was also meant to reclaim public space and to do that by democratizing the practice of monument building. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the various elements of that project. So these are the women that were honored by this project: Eleanor Eldridge, Ida Lewis, Katie Brownell, Sarah Harris Fairweather, Dr. Harriet Rice, and Charlotte Daly. So there were various elements to this project. One was just to decorate the space, to draw attention to folks who were navigating the space of the park, so that while navigating the space of the park, they could learn about the histories of these women. There were various ways to engage with their biographies. There were sandwich boards that led you through the park that you could navigate. They were color coded, so each woman had a color that was designated for her, and you could read her story either by walking along and reading these sandwich boards, or if you had a little bit more time, you could follow the vinyl paving stones that you see in the bottom right-hand corner. There are also binders of research, handwritten letters, photographs, research documents that sort of create a story for each woman's life. There were also scent jars that encapsulated different elements of each woman's story. There were soundscapes, there was candy that was handmade and created in the same way that candy during that time or during that era would have been, and in flavors that were popular at the time. There were also, if you look at the bottom left-hand side, these postcards that were designed and printed by me, where visitors to the park were encouraged to write the names of people who they wanted to remember. And we used those cards to, we used General Burnside's platform to literally like tell the stories. We wrapped the platform of his monument in those cards. There were also decorations around the monument, pennant banners with screen printed images of each woman and feather flags for each woman. And with that, thank you.
Thank you very much, Becky. Really fascinating. I look forward to our conversation in a few minutes.
Yes.
So Mel, if you could come and talk about 10 minutes about your project, that would be fantastic. And then we'll start our conversation. And I'll stop my video so you can have the full floor.
Great, thank you so much. And hello to everyone. Thank you all for joining. Give me a moment here so I can share my screen. All right. This works. Let me I'll just share it so it doesn't start glitching up. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see this okay. So I'll just start. So my name is Mel. I consider myself interdisciplinary designer. I'm based in Boston, though I was raised in New Bedford, which is in South Coast, Massachusetts. I think when I was growing up, I didn't quite acknowledge the rich and deep abolitionist history that there is in New Bedford, but I think now more in recent years, I've really come to reconcile and recognize that in the ways that it has infused my own upbringing and awareness of how I navigate the world. So currently I'm a creative entrepreneur. I lead my own design practice called Isidore Studio, which essentially is exploring the intersections of art, design, and urbanism. And that's primarily working on things like web and graphic design, urban design, and photo collage projects at the current time being, but I'm always looking for ways to sort of expand beyond and explore different mediums and ways to engage with the environment around me. And this is also a recently launched practice, so it's been very interesting and quite a time of growth and learning to launch this type of practice in the midst of COVID and everything going on in the world, as it has been a very challenging time for all of us to deal with a lot of the realities of the ways that our society is running. So, and also prior to this work, I actually was in school for the past year doing my master's in city planning, though on leave currently, but that's sort of the foundation of a lot of my work, is this fascination with cities and the way that they're designed and structured, and all the things that go into place of how we look at the world around us. But aside from my own professional journey, I'm also an artist, mainly in street photography. I think street photography is one of the things that brings me the most joy, and also is one of my top sources of inspiration. As I've sort of lived in places in Boston or traveled around the country, whether places like New Orleans, Philadelphia, or Detroit, I've made an effort to venture into Black and brown spaces and document them in terms of the physical materiality of the landscape. And I think that these curiosities and explorations have really been a key foundation of how I've come to be in my practice. So today we're really sort of coming about for this particular question is unpacking what we value and uphold in physical space. And this is a question that I've really been inquiring for some time through a number of initiatives and projects. And I think this inquiry really stems around how we look at the space around us and how does it hold the intentions of our society. And I think that there's a lot of cues, and once you dig into the layers, and particularly as I've been digging into the complexities of city planning, really understanding the deep structures and the ways that everything that physically looks a certain way around us everything is by design. So before digging into my own work, I wanted to put a note about this language, because I think that there's a lot of terminology that is thrown around in the field, depending on where you're at. And I tend to veer away from the term placemaking in terms of shifting more towards the terminology of placekeeping, essentially because when we're thinking about memorialization and commemoration, space is not neutral, it's never stagnant, and there's always these contested forces. So when we think about memorialization, it's very much important to understand that it's really much rooted in enhancing what is already in the space, and there is no space without a history. So in essence, whenever there is an effort to really enliven a space, it very much is about evolving what is there rather than writing over the histories that have already been in place. And I say this all because I think that we don't want to get caught up on language, but at the same time, we do want to be very intentional about the language that we do use, because I think that it holds a lot of values. And when we make certain shifts in our terminology and our language, we can shift the ways that we navigate and the values that we hold as we go into certain projects or initiatives. So now I'm going to dive into two projects that I've been involved in over the past couple of years. These are two projects that I've gotten involved with prior to having my own design practice. I worked full-time at Sasaki Associates, which is a design practice in Watertown, and I was fortunate to have involvement in these two that I'll dig into. And they tie together in a multitude of ways. They're both based in Roxbury, but they sort of lead from this experience of inquiry and curiosity towards the actual implementation. So how going from the period of asking a lot of questions and digging deeper into asking more questions after that, then to actually manifesting those inquiries into a physical space that will show up in our physical realm. So this first project, A Voice at the Table, is a research initiative that I led. It took place mostly in 2019, though just wrapped up this year. And it's a research initiative that explores the role that affirmative spaces play in promoting community building, empowerment, and resilience for Black women in Roxbury, Massachusetts. And this is a project that I led, but I was also on a team with Breeze Outlaw, Elaine Limmer, and Nayeli Rodriguez were the core team members who we all worked on this project at Sasaki. And really the driving force of this type of inquiry, and as it relates to memorialization and commemoration, is really looking at the present, in the present times, and really asking the questions of what is valued now and what are the spaces that we're currently navigating and moving through, what are the values that they're upholding in the present, and what can we learn, particularly by diving into the experiences of Black women who are often left behind in terms of the ways that cities are planned in the more formal sense. So through this project, we did 16 one-on-one interviews and had 109 survey responses. So it was really a major effort to ask a lot of questions in ways that I think that oftentimes Black women are not included in the formalized dialogue of planning and design. So this is a collage that was made that highlights essentially all of the spaces that folks who we reached out to sort of highlighted as popular spaces, or spaces where they felt comfortable, where they felt valued. So going back to that original question about, what values do we uphold in physical space, the purpose of this type of graphic, and also sort of pairing this sort of theoretical framework, but also with the physical design lens, is to really think about how do the visuals hold the sort of invisible values of the space. And these type of spaces, things that range from cafes to market spaces to gardens, it really sort of highlights the type of landscape that people are really placing value on. So when we think about commemoration, if we're trying to bring about a new space, I think this project really sort of is rooted in asking what is value that is already there. And I think too, it's been quite fascinating that it was also done in 2019, which in the midst of everything going on, it really feels almost like ages ago, even though it was only wrapped up this year. So that brings me to my next slide, really to come to the core reflections of the project. Is this really need to embrace eclectic and diverse design standards. So when we're thinking about memorials and commemoration, sort of going beyond the formalized sense and thinking beyond the formalized sense in which we value spaces in which commemoration happens in the physical realm. And then two, emphasizing the need to really build these deep understandings of the socio-spatial politics of spaces. I think that when we choose to be blind to the politics, and when I say politics, I mean power structures that are in place. When we choose to be blind to those, we don't actually get to the root of the problems in place. And in order to understand those and to create spaces that are affirmative and empowering for people, we need to understand the multi-layers of forces that are impacting people's ability to live. And then third is the importance of documentation and archival work in Black and Brown communities. I think through this project, it really has enhanced the value of, how does documentation archival work sort of support this commemoration or memorial process? And that can happen both in physical spaces, but also digital spaces as well, particularly now in this time where we're so infused in the digital realm. I think that it's important to understand the ways that, we think about, like Renee had showed, this sort of commemoration that shows up in the digital realm as well. So there's a link there for any folks who want to learn more about the project. There's a project website. So that's that project, which then brings me into the second project that I wanted to talk about, which kind of stems from the A Voice at the Table project, which is the Frederick Douglass Memorial Landscape. And this project really takes a lot of the learnings from that first project and a lot of the inquiries and really sort of cements it in a real physical space. So this project, I am just one of the many people who have had a hand in making this vision come to life. So first, I'll just say on the left side there is the memorial itself. And that memorial is designed by local artist Paul Goodnight and sculptor Mario Trudeau, who's out in Los Angeles. So that's been an interesting process to work with artists to really understand how the sculpture itself is sited in a larger landscape and how they're all collectively paired together in this, one cohesive space. And these are just a couple photos of the site itself, which is located on Tremont Street. For folks who are familiar with Boston, it's close to Ruggles Station, right next to Slade's. And just to give a little bit of context to the site, because these are a lot of the histories that we sort of dug into to try to understand how this physical landscape really reflects the history of the space that is there. So the space has actually been dedicated to Frederick Douglass Square since 1917, which was quite fascinating to learn that it had been dedicated in, I guess, the formal sense for over a decade, but there was lacking this sort of this emphasis to really cement that in place. And then a couple sort of sites just to highlight. The second one there, right next to the site that we're located at, is one of the oldest buildings in the area, and it was formerly the Douglas Square Pharmacy, but even before that, it was a grocery store that actually housed activities on the Underground Railroad. Across the street, number 3, is the former Boston Guardian newspaper, which was the oldest or first and oldest Black newspaper in the city of Boston, which ran in the early 1900s and ran until the 1950s. And then right on the opposite side is Slade's Bar and Grill, which still is there today, which is the oldest Black-owned restaurant in the city, which holds a lot of really important value in terms of the community space there in Roxbury. So that's just some of the layers of history that we were sort of unpacking, and there's obviously much more to this, but these are some of the highlights of, as we think about this history, how do we commemorate that in physical space? And this is our core team, and I want to highlight this team here. So the core team is, on the left is Diana Fernandez, who's one of the collaborators and project manager on the Sasaki end, who I've been working with them, and on the far right is Breeze Outlaw. And the 3 of us have been the core landscape designers on the project, and it really has been such a joy to work with them on this project, and to be on a project that's Black design led has been, I would say, it's very rare in terms of a project of this scale, which has been it's been quite fascinating to see the ways that we're sort of peeling back the layers of things that we've been taught in the more formal sense of how design should happen, and how we check ourselves, and how we try to envision something that looks a bit different. And then also in this picture, we have Aziza in the black dress, and then Duma, who they have been spearheading the project on the community's end to really help realize this vision. Particularly Aziza, she has been involved in this project and spearheading this project for over a decade. So, and I've only been involved on the design team for the past year. So I just wanted to give a shout out to them to really putting in the work to make this happen. And this just sort of starts to get at how do we manifest these values in a physical landscape. And this is a quote that we've been really inspired by throughout the course of the project, is when we think about commemoration, memorialization, with this quote in particular, we have to do with the past only as we can make it useful to the present and future. So this has really been inspiring us to think about how does the creating a memorial space serve the community today in a way that it's not just so rooted in the past, that it takes part of the past, but it also builds a thread between the past, the present, and the future in a physical landscape. And some of these snippets below are some of our spaces of inspiration. From the far bottom left is the Delphinium Garden Club, which is a series of photographs that were taken of Southern African-American gardens that had this very eclectic nature, which was a major source of inspiration. Taking things from the local community, and that second picture of the sunflowers, like the Roxbury Sunflower Project. And then the last 4 just starting to get into the materiality, bringing in warm tones and thinking about curved edges. And also Breeze has done a great job in developing a planting palette that really thinks about ways that the actual, the life of the landscape, the plants on the land, are actually serving the community, having things like medicinal herbs that people can actually use for their own health and well-being on the site. And that was one of just a few ways in thinking about the ways that the physical landscape sort of gives back to folks in its current realm. And this, just to sort of close on this project, this is just a rendering of how we're envisioning it to come about. The project is still in progress, but the essence of this is really trying to capture the life and sort of aura of the sculpture itself, but also the people around it, and to peel back the layers of the history, but also looking forward, and to create this this space that feels open, but also has an enclosure that allows people to feel in this space that they can be with the sculpture, they can be sort of removed from the street a bit, and they can be surrounded by the plants that are also giving an essence of life to the sculpture itself. And there's a link there as well for any folks who want to learn how you can get involved in the project that is still ongoing, and we're hoping to have it be constructed next year in 2021. And on that note, onwards, I'll just say it's been quite a journey to be on these two projects for the past couple of years, and I'm still pretty young, but it's been a learning process the whole time, and very exciting to really learn as I go on these type of initiatives. And I think that they very much are always growing and evolving in time, and I'm excited to see how these works may inspire others to sort of follow through on similar efforts, but also how they can evolve into ways to push beyond the thinking of memorialization. So I'll hand it back to Renee.
So stay on screen, and Becky, if you could join us, that would be wonderful. And the three of us can start this conversation. So I think how we're going to work this is I have a few questions for you. And in fact, Mel, you set me up really nicely with this idea that space is not neutral because it's at the core of the work that both of you do. And so what I want to do is I have a few questions, and then I will attempt to navigate the Q&A. If folks would like to start to enter questions, I will be monitoring that as well with Emma and Kim, and try to weave it into our conversation. So I want to start with this idea that space is not neutral, because one of the things that struck me, Becky, in your presentation in particular, is this idea of reclamation of space that occurs in all of those sites, but you're doing it very differently. And you're doing these really rather large interventions. So and that's what I consider what you're doing is an intervention. So if I have that wrong, you can correct me. And Mel, I was interested in you using this notion of affirmative space, which I think is perhaps different from reclamation of space. So I wonder if you two could talk about that a little bit. Becky, I'm going to throw it to you to start.
Thank you, Renee. So yes, I absolutely agree with you in the characterization of that project as intervention.
Mm-hmm.
I see it, well, I saw the act of sitting, holding space on the monument as a way to insert my personal experience and all of the postcards, actually with the exception of Louisville, the place that I showed you, the postcards, I wrote 2 to each politician. The first one sort of gave the context for my relationship with the space, and then also what I know to be true, that what we see in public space or monuments are not neutral. They have a positioning, they have a function, and that function is to assert power or control, or like they're a covenant with a certain people or a community with their future selves.
Mm-hmm.
So how can I insert my personal experience in a way that they can empathize with and say, hey, I never thought about this space in that way. Maybe I should think a little bit more about how we use it and how it can be more inclusive for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, and I think those are all really great points. And I think sort of tying into the lens of thinking about affirmative spaces, that inquiry was really rooted in this question of when we think about challenging and sort of contesting spaces, as you mentioned, what values are we trying to infuse in? So this question of trying to unpack what are affirmative spaces for Black women was really this inquiry of like, what values are being upheld in spaces that make Black women feel like they are seen and feel like they are heard in ways that, you know, these generally most spaces in the United States, but also, and this is a national thing, where, you know, we don't feel as like we're fully included in the spaces in the public realm, which is not always, it's not a space for all. So this idea of affirmative was really trying to dig into those layers of when we're contesting, well, what are we contesting for? So it all is very much, you know, overlapped and layered, and yeah, essentially that.
Okay, no, I think those are really interesting ideas, because I particularly think the first project, Mel, that you showed really gets at this idea that there can be multiple voices, right? Like this is a core problem with monument building, is that we oftentimes do not have multiple voices or multiple voices that can be heard. And there's a question which I'll get to right shortly, Dania Sherman, but I have another kind of question I wanted to ask that ties back to this, because I'm really interested then in both of your practices. Like how do you democratize the involvement of a public, and that's a hard term. Like who is the public, right? How do you get public participation or community participation or buy-in? I've seen projects in my own work where communities are dedicated and they do really good work, and then where there's exclusion almost built into the process, the monument building process from the get-go, without people realizing that they've done that. So could you talk a little bit about this notion of democratization and how that might fit into both of your work?
I can jump in. Yeah, I think one of the things that we've been talking about a lot amongst our team for the Frederick Douglass Memorial was thinking about this idea of critical engagement over critical mass, because there's often these sort of dialogues, particularly in the, I would say in the formalized planning field, there's this desire to just get masses and masses and get all the numbers up, and it's not always rooted in that. It's very much rooted in, you know, do people feel like when they speak up, do they feel like their voice actually is heard and is mattered? And I think that for this project was one way that we're thinking of how do we challenge the ways that we've sort of gone about engagement for previous works. So for example, when we had our engagement session for the project, we hired a local artist at Destiny Polk, who does spoken word. She's a dancer and also does a multitude of other things in the community, as leads Radical Black Girl. But we hired them to do a spoken word piece before we did any of the engagement. And I think that, you know, having that type of process in terms of engagement, which I haven't experienced that in a community engagement meeting for a physical space before, I feel like that process really opened up the space. It created a sense of intimacy that allowed people to, I think, open up in ways that you could definitely feel the energy and the shift in the tone in the room. And even though I wasn't a massive group, we're in a full conversation dialogue with maybe 20 people in the room in a way where everyone felt, you know, to my interpretation, folks felt like they had the space to vocalize their opinions, to vocalize their voice. And I think just these types of shifts in ways that we think about process, those are certain ways in which we can democratize. But I think it is hard as well, because I don't always believe in this idea of spaces for all, because I think it sort of oftentimes that defaults on white folks being the priority, which oftentimes we need to sort of challenge that, and we actually do need to prioritize certain groups when we're you know, building out new spaces and elevating new spaces, because then we need to, because essentially everything we've kind of been taught about our landscape has been Eurocentric. So there needs to be sort of these focused efforts to challenge that and to create new ways that we can allow people to have a vision for their environments.
Well, I absolutely agree. I really admire the work. Even the title, A Voice at the Table, implies that it's not just like one person that's being honored or one position that's being honored, but like a collective. And so I think, or particularly with the My Living Monument project, the idea was sort of a way-finding experiment, or a way to activate space through social engagement, through conversations with folks. And there was a little bit of flexibility with not having, with it being an intervention and not a permanent structure or a permanent thing or object or device that was staying in the space, but really creating an experience where not only could folks learn about histories, but also invite them to share a bit of their own history.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, like you were bringing up about this idea of temporal spaces. And a lot of times when we're thinking about this memorial discussion, it's these very, these bronze statues, which is not the only way to think about memorials and that type of sense. And I think that the temporal holds as much value as the things that, you know, last for decades. And even in the Voice at the Table project and listening to a number of folks, some of the projects that came about that held a lot of value in the community. For example, in the 80s, there was a series of murals that came up in Roxbury where there was no permission asked for these. They came up and they're very Afrocentric and held a lot of energy of liberation in the ways that they came about by a series of Black artists in Roxbury. And though that they no longer exist, or actually there is maybe one, but there's a whole series of them, and a number of them cease to exist, but they still hold their value. And I think that when something isn't physical anymore, it still holds its value beyond the time that we can actually see it in the space.
I really like that, Mel, because I would say it holds its value and what's so interesting in memory, like in some very, like an individual memory and how people will carry that work forward. I mean, I think that's a really interesting idea. Mel, we have a question for you, so I'm just going to read it because it's rather long, and then there's a question for both of you. But Mel, you mentioned, and you all reference in various ways, the importance of the social and political context that space is grounded in. I'm wondering if you know of any promising networks that are helping to organize people in these fields, artists, designers, even planners, historians, around issues of spatial justice locally, regionally, nationally. Feels like we need to do more organizing to help build your great work. So that's the question. And I would say actually Monument Lab in Philadelphia is doing some of that work, right? So they are a history and artist designed lab studio in Philadelphia that has been doing kind of amazing interventions, right, in Philadelphia's memorial space. But Becky or Mel, really that was directed towards you, but do you have a response to that, like other kind of networks that people are joining to do this kind of work?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question. And I think it also varies by location, because I think that, you know, in the Boston context, you can point to a number of spaces, like, for example, I know like DS4SI, who was one of the co-sponsors, I believe, for this event. Like I've been to a number of their events, and sort of events and other activities where I appreciate they sort of challenge the ways that we're thinking about planning in the landscape. And really the purpose of what they're doing is kind of challenging the ways that we socially engage with our environment. So that's one that I would point to locally. I also do work with Black Market in Roxbury, who they don't have their physical space open now because of COVID, but back in 2019, there was a series of engagement events with the community that allowed folks to have more of a community-centered vision in terms of planning that wasn't as much, say, city-led. So those are a couple sort of on the ground, and there's so many that I could go on for the local context, but on a national scale, there's also, I'm not involved, but I know a couple folks who are involved with Design as Protest, which is creating a sort of series of demands and also a vision for how to think about design from like a landscape and physical sense that challenges the ways that we're going about it. And we've been sort of taught in these you know, just formulaic institutional spaces. So that's one on a larger scale that I would recommend. But I'm sure that there's so many others that I'm missing.
The Smith Group here in DC just did an intervention on the space on the mall with a really interesting thing around mass incarceration, did an installation that you could kind of enter and have an experience in that space. And I even think about Mass Design Group, who did the National Memorial for Peace and Justice down in Alabama, who are trying to create like a whole new understanding of memorialization. So there's a second question that says, and it's for both of you, do you think as a Black woman that you bring a different voice to thinking about space?
Personally, I think absolutely. I think that everyone has a unique voice to add to this conversation, and that everyone has a valid engagement with space, considering the way they navigate the world, considering their personal histories and cultures and the things that they hold dear, that should all be considered when we're thinking about how we hold memory and how we think about the past with empathy and with honesty.
Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think too, like that point, it's like we all have our own biases, and I don't mean that in a negative sense, but we all hold our certain biases and ways that we see the world based on our identities and our experience. And personally, as someone who identifies as Black and as a woman and also queer, these are, you know, all of those intersections are ways that I sort of experience the world and sort of see the layers in which, you know, those are groups that are often disadvantaged in the more formal sense, I would say. I personally choose to not see myself as disadvantaged, but in the formal sense of like the country, that's, you know, there's obviously disadvantage to navigate that. But I think that these experiences and these identities allow me to see the layers in which like the structure is not working, essentially. So, you know, to be on the margins, to be on the fringes, you can see the ways that things aren't serving you because it will be last to reap the benefits and the rewards. So I think that's why it's powerful to have Black women involved in things, to deconstruct the systems that we're in, because we can see the ways that systems are failing because we live in it every day.
Mhm. Thank you, both of you. Those really smart answers. I mean, and I'm going to respond to this because I think that my research comes very particularly, I came to it because I got really tired of the Confederate monument conversation, and that there were not Black voices being heard in that conversation, but also the kind of denial of slavery and how is it that memory works around slavery. But it comes very particular also from being a child who went to predominantly white schools when slavery was talked about, and everyone turning to look at me as a child and not realizing until I started my project also, strangely, the shame that comes with some of these legacies that are kind of put on us that we don't realize that we've internalized over time. And that was a really interesting thing to confront in the middle of my project as well. Mel, people are very interested in the Frederick Douglass Memorial. And you know, I know Mario Chiodo's work. I've written on a couple of his monuments, actually. He's a major monument builder in the United States right now, who's designing that. So this question asks you very particularly, Mel, can you talk about some of the design aspects that help define how, I haven't answered yet, help define how the space is used by the community, seating, gardening, performance, and has it been difficult to walk the line between this, what the city might want, right? That of course is a fine line, and what the neighborhood wants, and then what the community has voiced of what their needs are. And that's a great question because it gets to the core of this, right? About memorialization and monument building.
Mm-hmm.
So Mel, I think it's directed towards you, but I think Becky, you could also answer this as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. And we've definitely gone through so many design iterations to see how it came about. But I think that contestation between what the vision is and what sort of the structural barriers are, I think that's been, as a young person involved in a landscape design project. I'm not a formally trained landscape designer, though on my team, Breeze and Diana, they're full-on landscape designers with more of a wealth of knowledge of the process than myself. So it's been, but I think for all of us, it's been a real process of growth and learning to really understand the barriers and things that we can push back on and where we can push certain agendas. I think for one, you know, one of the core elements of thinking about the monument itself is thinking about the siting and the orientation. You know, where is Frederick pointing? Where is he looking, and where is his body going? And there was a real priority, basically unanimous from the community, for him to be facing towards Roxbury. So that was something that kind of really cemented the design in place, and everything sort of came about that. There was this desire and even it was nice because a lot of the feedback also paired with our own interests as well. So, but there was a desire to have this sort of oasis feeling with lush greenery, but also with that, you know, being mindful about maintenance and all of those type of things, where it's like you can only have certain types of plants because, you know, when you're thinking about design, it's as much as what it looks like in that snapshot of, you know, when it's first built, and then, you know, the best design is one that, you know, still holds its strength, you know, 10 years down the line. So thinking about certain plantings that are resilient and also may offer sort of medicinal benefits. And for example, the Roxbury Sunflower Project, we really wanted to draw in a planting palette which Breeze mainly worked on the planting palette that really brought in this element that tied to the community, but also brought in this larger sort of Afro-Indigenous feeling for the space. And then also when thinking about how the actual space was built, making sure that there was some type of barrier to the road, so it creates more of an enclosed space, that there's a sense of protection and feeling in the space that you wouldn't be with all of the rushing cars going by. And at the same time, there was a number of things to go through and loopholes to go through, from very sort of small technical things like moving a bus shelter and making sure like the floor plane, there's building in accessibility to make sure that everyone can access the site, and there's pathways for folks in wheelchairs to be able to experience the landscape. And we have all the seating sort of kind of going around the landscape, but also having this opening that faces towards Roxbury, that if it wants to spill out and go down Cabot Street, they could close off that street and have an event that sort of guides you towards the memorial. So really thinking about how the space extends beyond itself, because it is a small site, having that sort of futuristic visioning in mind of how it can be sort of manipulated and used in different contexts.
I love that idea of how the thoughtfulness of like creating ways for it. It sort of speaks, harkens back to the conversation that we were having about like democratization, right? Like how we can not only what the object is or how the space functions, but how we can be in communion with the land itself, like how the space can give back to the community that it sits in, rather than being the static structure that that just communicates an idea. It also welcomes, it's a space that welcomes communion with it, and engagement with it, and works to make the community like a better place and give back.
And there's a question which we're going to come back to, but I'm really actually, so I'll hold off, because there's one about actually the traditional nature of the monument, Mel, that actually I'm going to ask it now because it ties to what we're talking about. So Mel, the object that you all have picked, you've picked a very traditional artist, or the city or whoever picked that Mario to do that monument. It's figuration. It's fairly like a Beaux-Arts vocabulary that he's engaging, kind of a naturalism, the movement, all of that. So what someone's asked you is, what is non-Eurocentric public space, particularly in terms of future orientation rather than reaction to the past projects? So the Frederick Douglass project seems to be very traditional. Is this Eurocentric? Like what's happening in that space?
That's a good question. And I think I also have been asking myself a lot of those questions as well, and being involved in the project. I think, for one, the sculpture is interesting because it is multiple figures. So there's on that front, but although I wouldn't say that I'm involved in the physical design of the sculpture itself, and that all sort of predated my involvement on the project. So that's all stuff that was being worked around and sort of enhancing the landscape. So I will say on that front, I didn't have like the definitive like hearsay on certain decision making, but I think in going through the project, it really has been a positive space of reflection, and thinking about like, yes, I think that there are ways in which the sort of formal bronze sculpture, sort of points towards this sort of Eurocentric vision, but at the same time, I think that there's a fine line in which the ways that it actually does add a lot of value to people in space. And I think I've learned that through some other projects. For example, through Black Market, I was helping on the back end organizing the Black Lives Matter mural that went down Washington Street in Nubian Square. And there's a lot of people will contest the physical actual language of what Black Lives Matter means, which I think is actually a valid language conversation around how empowering that language is. But I think that there's a lot of contestation there. But I think through that, putting aside sort of the opinions on that, seeing the ways that it brought value to people as they walked past the space, and seeing that as something like this memorial, as much as maybe it does, sort of replicate this formal way of thinking about memorials. It does hold a lot of value when it's physically placed in people, and it does provide a space of empowerment for Black and Brown folks in this space. So I think in that sense, I think that there's both sort of approaches are valid. I think as we try to push forward the ways in which we, think about and challenge memorialization, I think it's important to challenge the formal practices. So for this type of project, how do we challenge the formal ways in which memorial is coming about? But I think as much as well, like for example, Becky's work is just as important to have this type of temporal things that are challenging it in a different way that isn't this more sort of formulaic ways. And I think both are really critical and important, because I do feel like these sort of very permanent figures, I think they are powerful, and I stray away from trying to just sort of push them aside and say that they'll never hold value, because I think that they do. And I think hopefully that answers the question a bit more. I think that it's always this fine line, but I think at the core of it, it's really the process that leads to the values that are upheld in the space beyond just the physical space itself.
I 100% agree with you, Mel. I have a both and attitude towards this type of monument building. There's definitely a power in seeing yourself reflected in the landscape. And we shouldn't forget that. We should honor that, but also create other pathways for engagement with the space, to create embodied experiences, to augment the power of the structure. So yeah.
Becky, I think that is what, in fact, is so powerful about your work, is this invitation as to participate in something that's ephemeral, but to enter those spaces and then transform it in that moment. And what I think, Mel, you're talking about this idea of the temporal spaces, but that the time or I really think of it as actually the ephemerality of your work. But that people have that encounter and then perhaps they leave and think harder about these issues that you're raising, particularly, let's say, with the Burnside intervention that you did. There's a question actually here that says, what are a couple of additional sites, if any, that you have your eye on as offering great potential for bringing these designs and engagement approaches to a wider community? Becky, are there some sites you're eyeballing that you want to do some more work in?
Well, I have been looking at a site here in Providence, Hopkins Square. It is a space that is designated to honor Isaac Hopkins, who was a ship captain, and a slave ship captain specifically, and was the slave ship captain of the Sally, which was a ship that was affiliated with the Brown brothers.
So that's one area.
Yeah. That's one area, yeah.
Mel, are you thinking more about memorial space as you proceed with your design career?
Yeah, I think kind of where I'm at right now is, aside from this type of work I had mentioned in the beginning, I also do street photography. And I think another way that I've sort of approached this sort of temporal aspect of things is I do a bit of street photography with like sticker art. So I'm thinking about sort of just these microcosms of sort of intervention and memorialization. I actually did a project in Providence and Boston where I took photos of spaces, and then I went back and I pasted the photo where it was in the physical space in time. So it's sort of, as you walk past the space, you could see what it maybe looked like 3 years ago. And a couple spaces, they actually, buildings are torn down, the landscape shifted, and seeing all of that. So beyond just sort of these memorials to physical people, just thinking about the shifts and ebbs and flows of the landscape. I think that's one way that I'm sort of shifting in as just an independent artist and creative on that front. That's one way I really like to think about just the basics of the everyday. When a building goes, when a new one comes up, how do we sort of reconcile with the constant changing of our environment on a day-to-day?
And that ties really into interesting questions of gentrification, right? As neighborhoods are transformed and what we remember that was in that space before, right? That we're all encountering that in cities. So there's another question here that asks about your interventions. And it says, when reclaiming or making space for Black folks, is there ever tension or collaboration with Native communities' narratives of constant displacement from home?
I that yeah, that is that's a tough question, but a really important one, and one that I've been thinking about a lot often, and trying to be more intentional about my relationship to space, and my relationship to Indigenous communities. That's one of the reasons why I insist upon acknowledging histories of land, not just my personal engagement with the land, but its overall history, and that I am an uninvited guest here.
Yeah, and I think that's a great question. I think for myself as well, it's like it's a constant process of education and learning. I think that's where it starts, is the self-education to understand sort of the roots of where we are, and also how that gets infused into the work itself. I would say for like the Voice at the Table project, that was definitely a learning experience for me in terms of, you know, the inclusivity of, for example, of folks being involved as well. So it was inclusive of like Black and Indigenous folks. So particularly for like doing the survey, you know, some folks, you know, Black people were here before colonization. So, you know, there's folks who identify, who are, you know, dark toned, and they identify as Indigenous and not Black. And sort of also reconciling with, and, you know, discussing those matters as well, and how do we be inclusive of that dialogue. I wouldn't say that, you know, I'm the perfect model of what that looks like, but I think for me, it's like, it's a constant process of learning and reflecting, and trying to maintain this intention, as you mentioned, Becky, about trying to expand the ways in which we are including voices in terms of our projects.
I agree. Absolutely, Mel. And also, I feel like holding space for the acknowledgement or understanding that these histories don't exist in a vacuum, that they're intertwined and connected in various ways, and trying to work towards increasing visibility for that. And like you said, just continuing to educate myself.
You know, in those issues, you know, particularly of, you know, this new kind of theoretical frame we're dealing with, settler colonialism, and how it relates in a more extensive way. I mean, I've been thinking very hard about, for example, this term of the Buffalo Soldier, and how they're actually memorialized, let's say, on the plains here in the United States, or not memorialized, and their role in suppression of Indigenous communities. And it gets really complicated. How do we acknowledge these the former United States colored troops, but now they're being used to oppress another people? And so how does that memorialization happen, or should it happen? And I'm not sure how that will be resolved, but I do think that's a really good question, right? How we do that acknowledgement. There is, there's an interesting question that says, I've seen arguments that we should make more monuments to important historical events as opposed to individuals. Do the three of you have an opinion on this? Yeah. Of course. Go ahead, Mel or Becky. Becky, go for it, and then Mel and I have something to say about that for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, so I absolutely agree with that. My personal opinion is that, you know, as humans, we're flawed. Everyone is inherently flawed. So when we make a monument to a person, rather than an idea or a community or an event, we always have to leave space for the fact that new situations, new information might come to light, and that this person wasn't perfect. So, you know, of course, we may find out something later that makes us question whether the monument to them is appropriate. But if we shift our thinking and create monuments or ways of remembering that are fluid and able to like evolve in the way that language evolves or the way that culture, or we evolve as people, it can leave space for us to have, you know, a relationship to memory that also evolves.
Mhm. Absolutely, yeah, and I think it's a critical question to be asking about, you know, who and what we're commemorating. And I actually dove into this question a lot this past spring. I was doing an independent study with my friend Mish, where we were particularly looking into the context of Roxbury and sort of inquiring about the context of Dudley Square being renamed Nubian Square, which, you know, is named after the Nubian Empire. And it was interesting to sort of dig into thinking about the implications of having a square named after a collective of people instead of a singular person, and really thinking about how we push forward ways of commemoration that are celebrating collective efforts. And what does that do to our society to be commemorating and memorializing spaces in our society that creates this agenda of commemorating collectivism? And a group effort that people aren't striving to, you know, have their own monument of themselves. They're striving to be part of that monument that that collective of people did. So I think that that's an interesting and also very vital way to think about memorialization moving forward. But I think you know, to sort of the earlier discussion, like everything is valid. I think it's important to have things that are collective efforts, but I do think it's also important to celebrate individuals who do go above and beyond to really put their efforts in a way that, you know, enhance society in ways. And I think that they all enhance the outcomes of our environment.
Yeah, you know, I actually agree with both of you. I have been of the mind that, you know, for me, the most powerful monument that I have encountered in the last couple of years is the National Memorial to Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. I went to the opening ceremonies, and for me, this acknowledgement of actually really difficult moments in American history, I find those to be productive memorials. So in that space, there is this acknowledgement of a history that's really been suppressed in the United States around lynching. And if you're a historian, you know the story of lynching and you teach it. But I think for Americans to actually kind of confront that and have to deal with it is super important. And so in that sense, I think I actually am and I'm not a monument builder, but I have actually long thought that we need a little pause in this kind of push to just stick up statues. We need a pause. We need some deep reflection, because I think, as Becky says, we're flawed as humans. So we can pick the next hero or heroine to put in public space. 50 years from now, someone will say, why did you put her up? She did all these other awful things, right? And I think we need to think about, you know, this idea of the individual statue, because it's so tied to hero worship in the US and in general in monument building. So I would argue that we need to move away from that. And I do think we need to deal with very difficult histories in some ways in our public spaces. So I want to actually, because we're coming to the end of our program, it's hard to believe that we're about to wrap this up. And I do apologize for the remaining questions, but we're not going to have time to quite get to those. But I would like to give Becky and Mel just a few moments to kind of wrap up their main ideas. There was a request that, Mel, you post that your PowerPoint somehow so people can access that information you had on the slides, and maybe we can shoot that through a Q&A and they can have the link. But if Becky and Mel, you could talk kind of wrap up, but also there are two questions that ask you about this notion of the ephemeral nature of monument building, of this idea of temporal spaces, and what does that look like? So I just put that to you and let you both take your time to just a few minutes to wrap it up.
So very quickly, I'll just say that, first of all, thank you so much for this. This has been truly a pleasure, Renee and Mel. I'm so happy that we had this conversation. I've learned so much. Thanks to everyone who's here witnessing this as well. In regards to temporal spaces, I would just say that, yeah, it's important to me. I don't know, I feel like having active engagement with different senses creates an experience that embeds itself in our memory. I read not too long ago about how the best way to remember something is to like activate more than one sense, because it increases the pathways in our brain that allows for memory to really take hold. So for me, this is an interesting provocation to work into the way that we think about public commemoration and monument building. How can we create experiences that activate more than one sense? That's not just visual, that's also auditory, that's, that also appeals to our sense of taste, our sense of touch, our sense of smell. That way, the memory or the collective memory lives within us and not just in a particular place.
I think you hit it like really on the head there. I think that it's really important to think about these ways that we are sort of marking memory in our experience. And I think it really only takes, a couple moments to really mark something in our lives that has an impact beyond us. And I think also to Renee's point as well, I think one of the core things I think that we're really looking for when we're thinking about, commemoration and memorialization is this feeling of healing. I think that, we're looking for these spaces where we feel like we can acknowledge and we can see and we can feel seen, and we can sort of let go in a way in an environment that doesn't always accept us. So I think that's kind of one of the core things that I hope folks sort of leave with this today, is I think in all of our spaces, just in general, whether that's, a more sort of formal monument like the Frederick Douglass, or things that are more temporal or creative in the ways that they're commemorating space that allows more people to feel healed by the environment around us than to be attacked by it or sort of brought down by it. And I think that's when we lead with that, then we'll be able to move forward and actually build a sound structure. But I think that healing is the core and first and foremost thing that we need in terms of our spaces moving forward.
Thank you, Mel and Becky. Right on. I totally agree with both of you about this notion of the multisensorial experience, that it's not just a visual, that in order to experience the space, we need to see, we need to touch, we need to feel, we need to smell. All of those things are part of it. But Mel, also this idea of healing spaces are essential. And I think that we need more of those in the United States, where we can come, basically inclusive spaces where people feel that they are welcome, and to actually, I love this idea that you can heal, or that you can move through the process of healing in public space. So that is our conversation for today. Emma or Kim, are you all going to pop back on? I wasn't sure, but we totally appreciate all of the fabulous questions that were asked today. So thank you for participating in this very lively discussion.
Thank you so much, Renee and Becky and Mel, for an amazing conversation, and just for sharing your creative practices and your insights and knowledge with all of us. And thank you again to everyone who is here as well for joining us. If you are able to stick around for the last 2 minutes, we wanted to just make some very brief announcements. One is that we will be sending a follow-up email from this, and we can include some of the links that were shared in the Q&A and in the chat, so that you all have access to Becky's and Mel's and Renee's work. We also will include a brief survey. We'd love your feedback on this event. And we are also actually at MAPC in the process of developing some arts and culture related policy recommendations as part of the update of our regional plan, MetroCommon 2050. So that survey is also an opportunity for us to know whether you're interested in helping us shape those policies for the future. So keep your eyes peeled for that coming soon. I also just wanted to note that this event, again, is part of a larger series that we're organizing called Public Art, Public Memory. And the last 2 events in that series are coming up next Tuesday and the following Tuesday. These are a 2-part workshop. They're designed as sort of a unit. So if you're interested in attending, we just ask that you register for both. And this will be an online interactive space facilitated by Paul Farber and Sue Mobley of Monument Lab. And it's going to be a really amazing event. I'm so excited, and an opportunity, I think, to start to kind of develop some of the ideas that we've all been discussing in this space today, in our conversation last week as well, and thinking towards the future and kind of what public processes for future commemoration could look like. So we hope you can join us for those as well. My last announcement is I just wanted to, again, give a thank you to the Design Studio for Social Intervention for co-sponsoring this event and this series. They have a wonderful new publication that they've developed over the last couple of years that kind of expands their thinking around this idea of spatial justice, which we touched on briefly today. So if you're interested in learning more about their work, we have a link in the chat for this zine they developed that includes writing from some of their colleagues who are artists and planners and activists thinking about what spatial justice looks like in this moment. So we encourage you to check that out if you'd like to take a deeper dive.
Awesome. And I think I'm giving a couple of updates as well. Thanks, Emma and Renee, Becky, Mel for this conversation. As we consider our region's commemorative landscape and public spaces, NEFA's Public Art Department has launched 2 new grant opportunities that we wanted to share with you all today. These are available to artists here in Massachusetts. And the first one is Collective Imagination for Spatial Justice. Collective Imagination for Spatial Justice supports teams of Massachusetts-based artists, creatives, culture bearers to do the important work of imagining more just futures, more healing for our public spaces and public culture. Perhaps you have a challenging or contested space in your community that requires some imagination work to recontextualize it. Collective Imagination for Spatial Justice could be a great way to start that journey. The grants range from $2,000 to $5,000 to support your imagination journey. And the application deadline is coming up on October 19th. And on the slide, you can see the URL. It's www.nefa.org, Imagine Spatial Justice. And then our second grant opportunity is our Public Art for Spatial Justice grant. And this supports Massachusetts artists and artistic collaborations to create public art, public interventions that foster public imagination and contributes to more just futures for our public spaces and public culture. So our Public Art for Spatial Justice grant is attempting to reframe public art making through a spatial justice lens. And these grants range from $5,000 to $10,000. And the application deadline is also coming up on October 19th. And the URL is also on this slide, www.nefa.org, Create Spatial Justice. And if you have any questions about either grants, you can always email us at publicart@nefa.org. I think those are all my announcements. Thank you so much for joining us, Renee, Becky, and Mel. And thank you to everyone who tuned in this afternoon. This was such a wonderful conversation, and we look forward to continuing it next week with the Monument Lab team. So thank you guys so much. It's been a pleasure.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.